Good morning. My name is Natasha Harris, and I'm a fourth-year women's soccer player here at San Jose State. I'm majoring in communication studies and minoring in child and adolescent development, and I currently coach for South Bay Football Club, and I'm an intern for the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change. The purpose of Keynote Panel Conversation 1 is to discuss the state of sport in society. Professionals that are on the front lines of sport and sport throughout will share their perspectives on issues, controversies, and experiential realities of athletes and stakeholders in the US and abroad during COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. Please help me welcome to the panel Shireen Ahmed, sports activist, public speaker and writer, independent journalist, California. Dr. Jules Boykoff, professor and department chair, political science, Pacific University, United States. Dr. Amira Rose Davis, assistant professor of history and African American studies at Penn State University, and Dr. Jamil Northcutt, Vice President, Player Engagement, Major League Soccer USA. This keynote panel will be moderated by Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique, Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change. We invite you to learn more about our panelists, their efforts, and works in your virtual conference program. Thank you and enjoy. Before we start, I wanted to start with a trivia question about our very own Executive Director. Please head over to your Instagrams and complete our most recent story poll to be entered. What is Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique's hometown? If you're the winner, it'll be revealed sometime throughout today's event and through Instagram. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to get into it. If you're just logging on and joining us, again, I'm Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique, the Executive Director for the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change. All I can say is 2020 has been an incredible year, locally, nationally, globally, in my home, multitasking with schooling of little ones. But it's happened across the world and in our society, and again, in the world of sport. In April of 2020, the Institute launched Sport Conversations for Change webinars. These Sport Conversation series discuss the current state of athletes and the groups and organizations that support them. These thoughtful discussions brought forth industry experts, scholars, and athletes to share insights on issues and challenges. And this day one keynote will continue this effort as we reimagine sport in the age of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. So again, I would like to introduce you to Shireen Ahmed, Dr. Amira Rose Davis, Dr. Jamil Northcutt, and Dr. Jules Boykoff, who will actually serve as co-moderator during our conversation today. He serves also, in addition to his many duties, he's also a faculty affiliate with the Institute. So we're looking forward to some good conversation. So we invite you to sit down, relax, listen, and see what you can get from our panelists today. So one of the things I really wanted to get into, again, it's been, of course, an eventful year, but these past few weeks have been quite exciting as well, particularly in the US. So if we could, let's get a little bit of understanding of really just a little analysis, if you will, on the meaning of athlete activism and political engagement during this time period. And I want to shoot this question to Dr. Davis.
Hi, good morning. Well, afternoon, I don't know. Hi. I am so happy to be here. And yeah, I think that when we think of athletic activism, you know, the key thing is it changes and it ebbs and flows. And Dr. Harry Edwards, of course, has used an analogy of waves. And I think that's helpful in thinking both historically, I'm a historian, about what it's looked like, and then thinking up to current day, how it's manifesting now. I think when we think about athletic activism, we're talking about a range of things, a range of activities that people engage in as athletes or as people within the sporting sphere who use their position to think through inequity, to speak out against inequality, to advocate for social justice. A lot of the times when we're talking in this country, we tend to think about racial justice and athletic activism, but a robust, kind of more expansive definition of athletic activism would allow us to understand that, like, pushes for pay equity in women's sports, multiracial coalitions that push for pay equity is also in this lineage of athletic activism. and also people who are not necessarily athletes, but who are laborers within and around sports. So the work that Jules does so well on the No Olympic movement, for instance, is part and parcel of this conversation as well. I think this year, to kind of answer the back half of that question, has put so much of that on display. We can think about activism that happens in 3 different places. Activism that happens on an individual basis from athletes who are using their platforms to speak out. There's activism within sports, sport institutions that look very similar to conversations that you might have within a university setting, or wherever you work, a bank or whatever, where people are having conversations in-house about inequity. And some of the conversations that we've seen in this past year have been of that nature. They're about making sport more equitable. And that's a little bit of a distinction from people within sports and athletes who want to use their platform to talk about other issues. And so we saw both of those on display this year. And then you have the last component to me, which is collective action. And we have seen an increasing amount of this. One of the things that has set this summer apart than a lot of earlier iterations, it's not just one athlete here, one athlete there, but we've seen entire teams, entire leagues take up this mantle in various different ways. We saw Wildcat Strike, which is points us to labor solidarity and labor organizing in a different way. And at the same time, we've seen an increase of corporate commodification of athlete activism that has really brought us into a place where we need to have really concrete, clear, hard conversations about the difference between kind of symbolic gesture and tangible material gains. And I think that we have had the last 6 months, and even before that, I would say the last 6 years really, but intensified in the last 6 months, all of these iterations of athletic activism on display.
Thank you for that. Dr. Northcutt, I mean, the role that you serve at Major League Soccer is a very important role. And sort of speaking to this same question, what is your analysis of the current status and current issues?
Yeah, I'll take it from this standpoint. And one, thank you for having me be on here. I really appreciate it. I think what you guys are doing at the university is great. But as it relates to the question, and people are really cognizant of what's just occurred within the election. I kind of always think that athletes have kind of always been activists and somewhat engaged. Again, you start thinking about your very own John Carlos at San Jose State University. I think about Jim Brown. I think about Bill Russell, Muhammad Ali, et cetera. The list can go on and on. I think what's fundamental to this conversation regarding this question is that sometimes we act as if athletes are not citizens and are not part of a democracy that we have. And given where we are now, athletes have somewhat become, a voting bloc. And so I'm very proud to see particularly our athletes in Major League Soccer, but even in other sports, it was really a push for voting. And one of the results that we saw is that we had the highest number of participation in an election in the history of our country. And so I think that's really significant. Additionally, I think what's critical to this conversation too is that athletes are not monolithic, meaning that they have different viewpoints. And these locker rooms are melting pots, so to speak, as we would say in the academy. That said, what I do want us to do is to learn from the sporting endeavor. And again, my hope is that we don't suffer from this phrase I coined as partisan Schadenfreude, meaning that we're gloating because somebody lost or we're gloating because somebody else won. And I think we as a society can learn from the sporting endeavor, particularly during this time, and really demonstrate the highest level of sportsmanship to kind of get us back to the place that we need to be as a U.S. democracy.
Thank you.
Shireen, you come to us from north of the border. You're in Canada. So Shireen, Ahmed, can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on athlete activism before and after this election that I know you've been following, even though you're up in Canada?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I would love to be in California, but I'm actually not. I'm in Toronto. I think that over the years and observing athlete activism in the many ways that has come, we've seen voter, mobilization, we've seen many things in this present, but athlete activism is not something that's new. And Dr. Northcutt had, referenced that we've seen it from Black women, we've seen it from queer women, we've seen it from queer Black women, we've seen it from different communities. And very specifically, I mean, the lens with which I look at things is also not only political in the sense of engaging in civic engagement. I've looked at it from uniform accommodation. I've specifically looked at it at hijab bans over the years, and what has happened. And that to me is specifically athlete activism. That is trying to make change and disrupt an existing system when the systems in which we exist are really problematic and weren't set up to include us meaning queer, disabled, racialized, BIPOC, whether it's journalists, whether it's athletes, whether it's coaches, whether it's officials. And I think that that's something else that I've looking at in the space to define activism in sport, not only from an athlete perspective, but as, administrators, as owners, and we've seen that when the WNBA, we've seen how owners have pushed back. We've seen how of the WNBA teams, we've seen how, Seattle Storm owners, and we recently had Jillian on as a guest on Burn It All Down. I'm going to absolutely give props to that best podcast that's out there. So a little bit biased, but I'm like, in terms of having the proceeds of ticket sales go to Planned Parenthood, not having restrictions on your athletes, on the athletes to go out and whether they want to protest a Muslim ban, whether they want to protest against, various things within society, but giving them that option to do that. And for me, this really coincides with civil liberty, with freedom of acting in a way conscientiously, and all those things collide. And so athlete activism, be it like anti-war movement, which is, Muhammad Ali, who's famous for that, whether it's Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, who stood against, being required to pledge allegiance because he wasn't comfortable with that, whether it's Billie Jean King, who's like, talking about pay equity, as Dr. Davis referred to. So I think this is something that we look at and we see it a continuation. I am a firm believer that social media has enabled and emboldened these activities, because I think that's a huge part of it. The athletes and the people directly involved and on the ground being able to express themselves very organically without having to go through a PR machine, without having to filter, because sometimes those filters can actually be muzzles, and I'm not a fan of that. So I feel like this is something those of us that have been looking at this, be it, in the academy or in the media, this is something that we'd like to see progress. It's also interesting to note how everybody in the bandwagon is trying to jump on this bandwagon, that this is a new thing, but I just would like to reestablish that this kind of movement has been ongoing.
Thank you for that. And even to your point there, Shireen, what sport-based social groups in this moment, based on all you said, really give you hope?
I would be really remiss if I didn't start with Black Girl Hockey Club. And they are an independent organization that has been on the ground for about 2 years. And Renee Haas, who's a professor based out of California, she's from California, not me, has done wondrous things in the hockey community and literally pulled in and created a family for people who are on the margins, who love the sport but don't feel included. And there's a tremendous amount of pushback from the gatekeepers in hockey about toxicity. It's almost like a refusal to understand it exists. So that's one that's adjacent to the sport, that's not affiliated with any major league. And I think it's done tremendous and is just been wonderful. And within sport, to see the WNB have a social justice council, which I think is imperative, and WSL has the same thing, a Black Players Coalition. We've seen similarly in the Premier League in the States, Marcus Rashford of Manchester United. And it pains me to say that because I'm not a Man U fan, but I will give this man his props. How they've taken things, and it just goes to show it can be one person with this ripple effect. So it doesn't have to be an organization, because often it starts there, but the movement it's fascinating and it's really important.
Thank you. Jamil, I know that you have done some great work in Major League Soccer, and the Black players have actually developed some of very important initiatives. Could you speak a little bit of that for us and talk about this notion of hope within the players, within these organizations?
Yeah, you know, I'm very proud of our players, and obviously, you know, if you go down through the sequence of events, you know, we can always point back to the marker, which was George Floyd and the issues that happened there. But there were other names that we could mention that led up to those events, and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and countless others, you know, that we've seen over the years. What I'm most proud about our BPC is the fact that when they did take on a protest, you know, within our office structure, we've got an ERG group, and I know we may discuss that at some point in time, but I think it's really important, Pitch Black, and just really in the player engagement space, the relationships that we have with those players have always been essential to our success and theirs as well. So given the events that occurred, you know, months ago, and how in the community as an administrator and kind of what we've experienced as a race of Black people, it was something that you knew was going to form and was going to happen. And I was very proud to see those players band together. And then if folks haven't seen the protest, you know, we had actually all of the Black members from each team represented when we started back to sports. You know, we had the MLS is Back tournament, and to begin that tournament, there was a time of solidarity where our Black players came together and formed. But more so than just protests, you know, there's actionable things that are getting ready to be implemented that we'll do as a group, as a league, with our group Pitch Black, other former players, et cetera, to kind of unite to start trying to address these concerns. And obviously those programs will be centered around civic engagement. They'll be centered around, we wanted to coin things to have meaning. You know, there's a soccer upper mobility initiative that will focus on pathways, advancement, as well as education and policy. Additionally, there's, you know, youth and grassroots and things that we need to do to kind of get into the youth space, but also continue to provide access at all levels of entry into the game. And then again, there's the supplier diversity initiative. So really trying to attack all of those areas, working with the BPC and other constituent groups, you know, just to address the issues of representation, obviously education and policy, as those things have kind of emerged as major themes as it relates to sports. But again, we all oftentimes talk about sports being a microcosm of American society, and we always want to try to make sure that we're addressing those issues to ensure that we're providing access and opportunity to black folks, but also other represented groups as well. And so, but I'm really proud of the BPC and the things that they're doing, and even seeing the cross-pollination with other sports like the NBA and the NFL, et cetera. You're starting to see more of that, which I think is really, really, really great.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's been really exciting to see what's been happening in Major League Soccer. I'm coming to you all from Portland, Oregon, where Jeremy Abobasi has been a leader on this front. And we're thrilled to see what he does next here with both his on-field skills and also off-field. I'd like to ask Dr. Davis your thoughts on some of the exciting groups and activities that are happening right now in light of the fact that, you know, social movements and activist groups create space for the kinds of athlete activism that we've been already talking about today. So what are some of the movements or groups that are part of that work creating the space for these outbursts of athlete activism that you're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, Shireen takes all my answers all the time, but I do want to dive a little bit deeper on the work the WNBA is doing, because I think it points to, you've heard me say, or maybe y'all have heard me say multiple times about them being a blueprint, but I really want to kind of unpack why, right? So when you look at the WNBA, you look at collective action, you look at a strong union, which has allowed players to really come together and be very unified in the steps that they want to take. And so if you go to the beginning of the summer, and the players decided that they really wanted to dedicate this season to Say Her Name specifically, and to Breonna Taylor. And specifically, they understood that Black women are often left out of the conversation about systemic violence, state-sanctioned violence meted out against Black Americans in this country. And they wanted to put that as the central focus of their season. And so what they did was, first of all, build a broad coalition of advisors to make this happen. They did a Zoom call with Kimberly Crenshaw to go to the person who literally coined the term intersectionality to learn about that. They have reached out to the families of the women that they were going to be sharing the stories of. They supported the Breonna Taylor Foundation. They also talked to activist groups on the ground. So one of the things that, we talk about sports being a microcosm of society, and oftentimes we think, oh, sports like reflecting what's going on, but we also know that sometimes it's in the driver's seat and there's this kind of push and pull that happens. But also, oftentimes there's this kind of rush to replicate things that are already in existence. And what the WNBA said is like, we are the experts in our field, which is basketball. And as we turn to start using our platform to talk about these things, let's reach out and see what's going on. And their partnerships with grassroots activists who have been the reason why we have such movement on the front for the movement for Black lives and things like that is because of grassroots activism, and their ability to reach out and form these partnerships sustained the activism that they were going to carry forward as a league. They also talked to political advisors and a number of other people. And then what that looked like is actually stoppage of play to uplift the stories of Rekia Boyd, of Atiana Jefferson, right? Of Breonna Taylor, and to go beyond painting it on a court or on a basketball hoop or on their jerseys, but to actually take up space and require and compel folks to really engage with the full humanity of the lives that had been lost. And then also, of course, they weighed into electoral politics. When co-owner of the Atlanta Dream, Senator Kelly Loeffler, is in her runoff election, of course, and she tried to use them as pawns in political games, which is a playbook as old as time. And instead of trying to get into this back and forth with her, which they saw, as soon as she was publicly admonishing the WNBA, her poll numbers went up. And so they pivoted and they said, what does it mean to not just say vote, because vote itself is not a mitigation of harm, because voting can be harmful if you're voting for harmful people. But to take it a step further and say, what does it look like to actually support a candidate collectively that embodies the values that we espouse as a league? And that's led to their endorsement of Reverend Warnock, who's also now in this runoff. And so you saw that the WNBA really raised the stakes of what it looked like to have collective action. And that was really impressive. And then the last shout out that I want to give is to a lot of the college organizations that have come out with their organizations for Black college athletes. In particular, I really want to give a shout out to Anna Cockrell at USC, which to my opinion, is one of the most transformative association for Black college athletes in the work that they do, in what they're insisting on from the university, which is scholarships for Black students who are not athletes, which is interventions and support to the community around the school, which is a very broad, inclusive understanding of Black Lives Matter, which is also speaking to the record number of Black trans women who are being killed and dealing with violence. And they're baking this all in within their organization, and they are doing tremendous work in very precarious contexts. So those are the two things that I really go to.
I love hearing about the interplay between athlete activists and these groups. They don't have to be totally separate phenomenon. Would love to get Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique to give us her thoughts on some of the groups that are animating your imagination right now.
Oh my goodness. For me, it's a number of our college student groups. I've had an opportunity to interact with students at various universities across the country that have really began to mobilize, begin to find their voice in these spaces. I think in many ways they've been inspired by professional athletes, inspired by the movement themselves, but they have also have lived experiences. And as I just hosted a panel conversation last night with 5 dynamic students in the Mountain West Conference, but they told stories of their lived experiences as young people, and those racialized experience and how it affected them, and then being in this moment, in this place right now, how it has really impassioned them and empowered them to speak up, use their voice, use their platform. So I really have to give it up to a number of those young people that are, again, our college student athletes that in many ways are sort of living what took place in 1968 with the Olympic Project for Human Rights, and starting to mobilize, starting to come together, starting to work with, whether it be those from their athletic department, to faculty across campus, to even reaching out to leaders that were the ones that the architects, if you will, in getting the movement made, because they're creating initiatives that not only speak to voting rights, but some of them are actually communicating with faculty on campus to create academic courses to say, hey, we need more diversity. We need more courses on race and race relations within our curriculum, so that it's not just we as athletes that have to tell the story and be the voice of Black people, but that all students and all those across campus can begin to understand the lived experiences of what we have endured. Because I think in many ways, there's an emotional labor that's placed upon those young people at 18, 19, and 20 that have to tell the story, that have to explain. And we don't often realize that they, in many ways, are still unpacking these issues. Again, as I say, many of them were born in 2000. So their understanding of history and that trajectory of race relations is in that short window. They've lived with a President Obama in their life, but they've also lived with a President Trump. So they're seeing these things and they're unpacking these things as they go. So for me, the young people are really coming together with regards to sort of reimagining sport activism, using their platform. I'm inspired by them of using, as Shireen said, using the social media as that platform to be able to engage, and using Instagram, using Facebook, using Twitter to mobilize. And so those are the things that I sort of keep in mind and really appreciate the interplay between the past, the present, and the future of athlete activism.
If I could just jump in here really, really quickly, I just wanted to correct myself. I identified the Seattle Storm co-owner as Jillian when it's in fact Jenny Gilder. I just wanted to correct that, and my apologies. And just to jump off what Dr. Carter-Francique said and Dr. Davis said about that interplay, I also want to just quickly mention, if people didn't know this, Ziara King, who's a soccer player with the Utah Royals, she did a collaboration with the National Women's Hockey League. And I love seeing that. Like, we watched in the Wubble when the WNBA players were watching the Challenge Cup. Like, I love seeing those collaborations. And this specifically that Ms. King is doing is a t-shirt design to bring awareness to different types of campaigns, for social justice. So just that interplay between the sports as well and the athletes is brilliant and beautiful and really, really important.
Yeah, I love hearing about the cross-sport pollination that's happening on these fronts as well. And with that, I have to mention a group that I'm pretty excited about as well, which is called Global Athlete, which is a number of international athletes who've come together to fight collectively to address the imbalance of power between athletes and administrators. A lot of them come from track and field, so there's like a nice parallel to San Jose State and the power there. There's people like Akwasi Frimpong, the skeleton Olympian from Ghana. There's people like Cara O'Donovan in karate from Ireland. Caleb Skinner, the cyclist. You got Ali Jawad, who's a Paralympian weightlifter from Team GB, Team Great Britain. And they've all come together to fight for justice. And really, let's be serious about money for these athletes as well. And they've teamed up with Ryerson University up there in your way, Canada. And they've put out a really important cross-sport study that looked at where the money was going when it came out of these sports. And they compared the Olympic sports, the Olympics, to like English Premier League, football, soccer, Major League Baseball, hockey, etc. And they found that Olympians only got 4% of the revenue that came into the Olympics, whereas some of these other sports, it was between 40 and 60%. So 4% compared to 40 and 60%. So I thought it was really interesting how this group, Global Athlete, was teaming up with academics to get their facts in order and then pushing out there and trying to fight for justice. Maybe we can pivot now to think about sports in the age of coronavirus. Of course, coronavirus has shaken up the sports world in a huge way. And as horrific as coronavirus has been for communities across the country and around the world, it has also possibly actually made some space to have serious conversations that could be considered positive in the sphere of sport when it comes to social change. So starting with Dr. Northcutt, if you could talk about kind of perhaps even counterintuitive possibilities that have emerged in this moment of coronavirus.
Yeah, so, one, given when we start talking about the pandemic, we have to acknowledge the folks that have, one, put it on the line and have lost their lives. And I think that's critical for us to say. Which is one of the reasons why the pandemic is interesting. So it's a true dichotomy going on. One, the horrific nature of it, and how it's impacted like these major pillars of our society. You start thinking about our health, our finances. You start thinking about the relationship piece that we have. Mm-hmm. And again, what we're trying to do is find the positive in that, which is come about from a standpoint of social change and kind of looking at racism. What's kind of happened with the pandemic is that it's kind of created this matrix that we couldn't get out of. We actually had to just sit in it. We had to witness it. We had to acknowledge the atrocities that have been impacting, particularly the Black community, but also, that extends down to others or across the board to underrepresented groups. And I think that's one of the positive things that has occurred. I attended an intern seminar one time as a young person, and one of the speakers that was there talked about the possibility. He said, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And I think within American society, sometimes the students have not necessarily been ready to kind of talk about race. But one of the positive things that I think that the pandemic has done is that it's allowed our students to be ready. The teachers have always been here. I've talked about it sometimes on multiple occasions about the voices being muted, just like we're here on this Zoom call right now. People have been talking about this for a number of years, for centuries, the injustices that have been going on, but either the students weren't ready, or it's kind of like if I were to mute my mic here, I would mute my mic, you would see me go blank. I could still be moving my mic, but nobody can hear me. And I think what the pandemic has done for us right now is it's given a voice to the voiceless. The fact that we had to sit, we had to watch the news. We couldn't go back to sport because we couldn't play sports. So we had to really look in the mirror and take inventory of kind of who we are as a society. And so while there's been a lot of deaths and things of that nature that's really been bad, I think the positive piece in this that we can take from the pandemic is that students have had to sit and listen to one another, our fellow neighbors and brothers and sisters who have gone through this, in our staffs, in our Zooms, in our Zoom meetings. We've had to listen to the stories and the experiences of folks who have been impacted by racism for a number of years as they've been living out their lives.
Shireen or Amira, do you have some positive spin outs? I listened to your radio show, which you mentioned before, Burn It All Down, and everybody should be a regular listener to this show, of course. And you tend to burn things down and also lift things up. So is there anything before we start maybe burning stuff down, lifting up some possible positives here from this coronavirus moment?
Positives, yes. So I think that, what COVID did was lay a lot of systems bare. Whether they're healthcare or education or sporting institutions, a lot of things were laid bare by COVID and by pausing and by, as Dr. Northcutt said, sitting in it, right? When you don't have SportsCenter current sports going around the clock, it's very hard to escape and retreat. It gives space for other things. But I think that one of the things that I have learned from a lot of conversations is what that also resulted in the capacity to organize and reach out and communicate with people. We talked to Tiana Bartoletta, US Olympian, on the podcast, who talked about her organizing efforts for governance in global track and field, and the fact that nobody was training for Olympic trials because they couldn't. And so all of a sudden, the space and time opened up to get on Zoom with track athletes around the world to talk about abolishing Rule 50 at the IOC, to talk about getting different things reinstated at Diamond League championships, right? Anna Cockrell talked about how she was able to mobilize at USC because of the time that she wasn't spending training for Olympic trials, but also that because of Zoom, it felt like people were closer. The proximity to people was closer. And she talked about how she built coalitions with like Black volleyball players and soccer players and swimmers that they never really had time to interact, especially at the college level, because your day is so structured. But I also think, and this is like kind of half burn, I'm sorry, but like it also compelled these conversations, because then you get to have these conversations like, do we need pandemic sports, right? Like we're rushing 19-year-olds back to the football field. It makes it very hard to make these same kind of like fluffy arguments that are usually trotted out about like what a student athlete is. Like if you're sending home all of your students, but your athletes are staying, and you're sending home your students because there's a COVID risk, but they're staying because you need the money generated from their programs, then it really, kind of gets your lie out of the paint, like, voices that have been calling these things out. It makes it a lot easier to point to it and have these conversations to say, well, hey, they clearly are athletes before they're students, right? Hey, stop pretending that this like, oh, everything's equal, when there is a very clear disparity in terms of funds. Like your entire economy, and I've said this on Biad before, I live in a town that's entire economy is based off of Penn State, based off of the football program. And even before the summer, even before this fall, one of the biggest income revenue generators for the town and for businesses is the blue and white game in the spring. And that was canceled. And with graduation also being canceled, many people were forced to go out of business before even the summer happened. And I think that one of those things that it compels this conversation is, if you build your entire system on an economy that can be so easily disrupted on the backs, right, of unpaid labor at this level, then in the wake of it tumbling down, you also have this possibility of rebuilding something in a more just way. And I think that that's so it's a little bit of a singe, but the hope, the kind of positive, is that many people have been stepping into these ashes of these things that ground to a stop or came burning down, to say, what is the world that we want to see? What are these institutions? What do we want them to look like? What do we want them to reflect? And in that has been, as we were talking about before, some of this really great organizing and collective kind of engagement around making the world better from the position that everybody is in.
I tend to be try to be chipper, because I think that's what gets me through things, is trying to be maybe naively positive. But I mean, there's some things that, like Dr. Davis said, are a half burn or a singe. I love that term. But just, from a media perspective, because this is where I exist, the space and where I exist, is the way that after George Floyd's murder, that sports media realized how ill-equipped they were to have the conversations and conduct conversations. And from my lens, that was crucial, because they were just, sort of puttering along since Colin Kaepernick. And I remember that somebody, I can't remember who it was, had written a piece like, politicizing sports journalism. And I'm like, I've never heard anybody I've ever spoken to say sports isn't political. I can't divorce my identity as a brown Muslim woman when I do my work. As an athlete, I was never able to do so. I was prevented from playing at a varsity level because I decided to wear hijab. Like, this has never not been political for me. I have never heard anyone who's not a white, straight man telling me that sports shouldn't be political. That's just not a thing. So the fact that media is starting to, say, well, we don't know how to do this because according to the Women's Media Center, sports journalism is occupied by almost 90% white, able-bodied, cishet men. Well, that's a lot of them. Having the same conversation, not being able to go off into other ones. And so like Dr. Davis said, conversations now that are getting intertwined with sports like labor solidarity that we saw and what that did and mobilization. And, I've also seen media look to academics like you all. I've seen Dr. Davis be called to CBC repeatedly, as she should be, to be able to share these perspectives. And yes, Dr. Carter-Francique, I'm gonna be giving Canadian media your number because they need to talk to you. And so I think that these are the things that have been mobilizing and being revealed within sports media. And there's differences between Canada and the United States. Like there definitely are. Youth Sport, our, or like our body, our organization of student sport has canceled everything this year. Completely, with no exceptions. There are training within, depending provincially, what can be mandated, but ultimately it's all been put at a halt. So there's no, I find it very similar actually to the Electoral College. It's very difficult for me to figure out what's going on where. Can't figure out Big Ten this isn't doing this. But also another conversation that I find is it's starting to reveal as well the discrepancies in between what will be protected in sport and amateur sport in our countries and not. Because I'm very fearful for amateur sport, particularly in Canada, that for the women's side has been very poorly funded. And that is something that is starting to get attention. I don't love that obviously it's happening, but the fact that it's getting more media attention is extremely important. And those are some of the things that I'm happy, you can't clean your laundry unless it's aired out. You can't. And this is, as much as that it's not the greatest thing, it's what it is.
Absolutely. And, you talked a little bit about the role of the NCAA. Dr. Davis, you brought that up. And it seems like, we have to talk about what's wrong with sport in order to figure out how to improve sport. So it can't be like an either or. We need to bring our critical faculties here before we can actually make positive change. We have to know what we're changing. So the question I wanted to throw on the table next is, there's been this move toward bringing the sports back, whether it's the wobble in the WNBA or the bubble with the NBA, or the special tournament that Major League Soccer had, where I should mention the Portland Timbers emerged victorious. And my question, though, is, is this a positive overall in society? Does it give us hope in some ways, or does it give us sort of a false hope in a respect of bolstering an ideology that we can just move back to regular life? I was interested in getting people's thoughts on the complexities of that little thicket.
I guess I'll jump in here. For me personally, I think it's a great thing. And again, I talked about these three areas that have been attacked, your health, your finances, and relationships. So the positive piece about it is, from a health standpoint, if we were to attack that particular area, is create an environment where those who are athletes who want to play, who want to compete, there's a healthier environment for them. And then from a financial standpoint, what's taxing is that it creates compensation. So there's a difference between the pro sporting endeavor and then the amateur model. And so when you're dealing with pro sports, there's collective bargaining agreements. There's nothing that people are going to do unless they come to a consensus on. And so that's kind of what you have dealing with there. From a relationship side, it allows the players to continue to interact and interface with their colleagues, their teammates, et cetera. On the negative side of it, there is the health concern. What if I do get COVID? How am I dealing with that or processing that? We've dealt with those issues as well. From a financial standpoint, in order to create this bubble or wobble, it's very taxing financially. It can create some issues and problems. On the other hand of that argument, it also can help to create opportunities to help fund certain things. The athletes continue to get paid, the folks that administrate the game, the sports that we love can continue and persist in an environment that could be seen or viewed as negative. And from a relationship standpoint, on one hand, there's the piece that I talked about that was positive, and on the other hand, there's the negative side where there's some isolation. You know, guys are going away, ladies are going away, competing for numbers of months away from their families, et cetera. And so that can kind of create some issues there. So it's somewhat bittersweet, I guess, to say the least, and kind of sum it all up. You know, my hat goes off to the athletes, because what I believe is that they've become somewhat of essential workers during this time. You know, we look at the medical profession, we look at people who are doing certain things, but what the athletes have been able to do for society, given this moment, is that they've become really, really essential from an economic standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, and then also from a relationship standpoint, creating opportunities and conversations for people to kind of talk about their favorite teams. It's brought some sense of joy and unity back to the world during this particular difficult time that we all are going through.
It truly has been, you know, a difficult time. And one of the things I think that's quite interesting, again, to take a note from Burn It All Down and the singes, that notion of deficiencies really rose to the top during this time period within respective organizations, and the almost immediacy of panic to get help, to get support. And so one of the things is to think about this notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So where in the sports world do we see sort of positive development in DEI work? More specifically, you know, I know, and we all know, there were numerous statements that were put out to talk about solidarity, and we are one with the Black Lives Matter movement and what have you. How do we sort of see sort of this shallow, as we call it, shallow spectacle masquerading as inclusion? Can you speak a little bit to that, about those statements that were put out about the push for DEI training and the needs and desires of these organizations to try to shift and pivot during this time period? I want to go to Shireen for that, to kind of give us a little bit of insight on what you've seen, how you've perhaps even been called in on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think we're looking, as what I was saying before, at a reckoning with the lack of resources, not resources in money, but resources in people who are informed on this and can speak to a sports space about DEI. And I don't want to confuse the term diversity and inclusion with literally trying to say, be anti-racist, be anti-oppressive. And words are important. I'm a scribe at heart, and I don't mess around with words. If we're looking at an anti-oppression lens with which to look with something, diversity, equity, and inclusion is like a fluffy way of saying that. I don't, you know, people are talking about rhetoric and performative allyship, but let's be kind to each other. I don't need y'all to be kind. I need you to be anti-racist. And let's be very clear about this. I mean, I live in a country that prides itself on being polite. This country that I'm a settler in was founded on the genocide of Indigenous people and on the backs of Black people. So I'm sorry, I don't want you to be polite. So let's start there. But can I enter those sports spaces that are predominantly not reflective of me or any marginalized communities and say this? There's pushback. So what happens is it's exhausting for the people at the front lines to try to enact change when they're the ones doing the most labor. This is what happens. And, you know, I have been told and been asked, should I read Robin DiAngelo's book? I prefer Layla Said's personally, because I'd like to hear from a Black Muslim woman on this, but that's fine. Everyone has to start somewhere. And one of the things I've learned, and I'll always hold very close to me in my own, you know, sort of observation, is Dr. Davis and I talked about giving people space to grow. And I was, I guess you could say, a little more on the radical side at some points, and was just this idea of looking at someone's journey and unlearning and relearning, which is extremely important. And we're coming to that. I'm not a fan. I don't have time to give out cookies. And people are like, I want to change this now. I don't have time for that. This is an 80 to 100-year commitment of literally undoing the systems that were created. So you want to in, it's not going to happen overnight. There are actionable steps that can be taken. You can mentor, give grassroots organizations money and get out of the way. Let communities lead who need help. I don't have time for white saviorism. I literally just get exhausted by it. Let those communities, whether disabled, they're queer, or whether they're racialized, let them lead, because they are the experts. So are people willing to hear this? I mean, and in some ways it's important to get in at a level and talk to people in a way they understand. It depends on who I'm speaking with. And there's some people that call me and I'm like, I actually can't help you. There's incredible anti-oppression educators out there that do this work. It's exhausting work. Pay them and get what you need for this. This is labor. Don't email anybody who may have trauma and say, can you help me unlearn this? Do the work. Do it yourself. And it is work. It's going to be extremely uncomfortable. I live in, again, I said, I'm referring Canada specifically as my own experience, but it's the one topic I've seen in my career that makes people the most uncomfortable. The diversity and inclusion and equity doesn't mean straight white women. I'm sorry, not to me.
And can I just piggyback on that, Shireen? Because I also think it gets back to the earlier question about pandemic sports. The corporate response this summer, right, that launched so many of these DEI efforts, we have to keep pushing them, right? And I want to give an example of this because it's really easy to get kind of misty-eyed about like something that's announced, like, you know, the NBA announced that we're going to convert all of these arenas into voting places. Do you know how many arenas walk that back? Like we can't just like see the first headline and rest on that, right? Okay, DEI work resulted in, you know, getting random words on jerseys. Okay, the Miami Heat were like, great, we're going to partner with Miami-Dade PD and donate money to de-escalation training. That is literally the opposite of defunding the police. That is giving a department that already makes $800,000 of their budget, that already gets that much, more money, which is not aligned at all with what people in that area were asking for in terms of accountability and police brutality. And these things sometimes can water down, right, the substance, and it becomes just another word, right? Just another shield for actual critical systemic change. And I think that for me, it's part of why pandemic sports have been so frustrating, right, in part. We just came through a summer where we had all of these. We had words, we had more initiatives, we had this, we had that. And people are still getting killed, right? These issues are not going away, and we can't get lulled into thinking they are, right? And that's one of the things to me that I've seen coming out of the last few months, where, and I think we're, you know, Dr. Northcutt is right to disaggregate, like professional sports going into a bubble or a wobble, to play under their CBA, you know, with opt-out clauses and things like that. That is certainly one thing, right? It's another with what we're seeing in pandemic college sports. It absolutely is. And it is, you know, when you have coaches saying, oh, they'll be fine. They're 18, 19, 20, they'll be fine. We need to run state money through the state of Oklahoma. Again, that was Mike Gunday said that. You know, when you have, you know, games being canceled every week because they can't field a team because there's too many positives, right? When you have a rush back to football in the Big Ten, but no other fall sports because they're not revenue generating, right? You're sending clear messages, but you're also putting people in harm's way, and you're doing it. And the question is, are they actually essential? What is essential about watching college football? It's not a feel-good question, but what is essential about it? Because it is entertaining. Okay, so then they're literally risking their lives and this, et cetera, for other people's entertainment. That's not necessarily essential. And I think that one of my biggest concerns the last few months is like this, I talk about this concept of sports washing. Sports do feel good. We're all fans of sport, right? You know, and we're also critical consumers of it. And I think that those things, I don't know about y'all, but for me, the last few months have held those things in so much tension, right? Would I love to kick back and absolutely get lost in the game? Yes. I just was talking to Ziara and Madison Hammond, who's the first Native woman to play in the NWSL. And I've loved watching their rookie seasons, right? But I also can lean into the feeling of like, when I'm mentoring college athletes who want to play, yes, and I want to see you play, and they want to play, and they're also scared. They're also scared about their health. They're scared about the health of the ones around them, right? And I think that sometimes asking this question of like, okay, what is essential about this? Who is benefiting, right, from this? And if it's a small group of owners that don't reflect the diversity on the field, that boardroom that we know is the next kind of frontier that we need to get DI efforts into, if they're the ones benefiting majority of the case, then how is that an essential kind of net good, right? And I think the last point I'll make about sports washing that we saw a lot this summer is how easy it is to water down something that has the capacity to be a vehicle of change. And I think about this, watching all of these baseball teams use Jackie Robinson's image, right, to say their Black Lives Matter statement. They always freeze him in 1947. They freeze him at this point of like breaking the color line and kumbaya. And they don't listen to Jack's own words about not being able to stand for the anthem. They don't listen to Jack's own words about police brutality. He has numerous articles that you can Google where he talks about that. And I think that that is something that really came to my mind as I watched the NASCAR lineup behind Bubba Wallace. And, they said, one day maybe we'll all wear 43. And it's like, no, we don't want to freeze Bubba in this moment with NASCAR lined up behind him and wearing 43, as if that is the mountaintop, as if that has solved all the issues, as if that moment, right, on the track was the end, when it really needed to be the beginning. What really was the beginning is the Black fans that came into NASCAR to greet Bubba and his emotion there. That is the beginning of how you rebuild. But that to me is like the power and possibility of sport isn't how much we love it and engage with it, but that doesn't mean that left unchecked or kind of uncritically consumed, that it's the rush back to it is like necessarily a net good. And I think that has been the tension that I know we've been wrestling with it on BIAD.
So let me jump in here real quick before we get off this topic. I think it's important, and I agree with you, especially when you speak to the Jackie Robinson piece. What people don't realize is that he died in his 50s. He was like 52, 53 years old when he passed away. That's really young. But you think about studies about racial battle fatigue, John Henryism, et cetera. Those are some things that he experienced that people don't really want to talk about. Again, we do want to sing kumbaya about those moments, but this man lost his life at a very, very early age, which is one of the things in the Black community is Black male morbidity, and how it's higher than any other group of persons that's out there. That being said, coming back to the essential workers part, I wrestle with this too, and particularly trying to bifurcate the pro game and the collegiate game. If you looked at my research around the dilemma of career transition of African-American male football players at Division I institutions, I played college football. I've been there, I've done it, I've lived it. I understand that the guys are scared, but we also have to look at the entire economic system when we're breaking down that. So the reason I communicated about athletes being essential, because they impact the entire economy of a university from top to bottom. You guys as professors, the town that's there, et cetera, it impacts it in a major way from the marketing and promotion of the universities. We know in higher education that enrollment is decreasing. It's been decreasing for years. And given the fact that there's no marketability of an institution, not saying that that's right or wrong, we need to have a conversation about the reality of it. That's why all of these issues that are coming to the forefront with name, image, and likeness. Like, these are important discussions that's going to continue to rise to the top. I'm happy and excited to see the athletes are finding their voice in this. They still are young men and women who are trying to create structures, et cetera, and need a lot of help around doing that. But I think it's important. They've been essential to people keeping their jobs. That's just the reality of what's going on. And so at the expense of their potential lives. I mean, so like, these are the hard conversations that have to happen. And that's why I refer to them as an essential worker class. It's like they're putting their lives on the line for other people to live. And so that's just to bring more clarity to my comment. That's kind of what I wanted to say, because a lot of people wouldn't be employed. There's a lot of people that have been furloughed. A lot of people that have lost their jobs in response to athletics endeavors not being able to persist during this particular point in time. And it's a big financial hit. Again, that's why I talk about those three institutions: the health, the finances, and the relationships. They're all intertwined. It's ugly, it's nasty, it's dirty. Sometimes it can produce some positive things, but sometimes it can get really, really, really muddy very quickly. So, but I appreciate you saying that regarding that, but I just wanted to provide some more clarity to it. And I look at them as essential workers in the sense that they're doing so much for us, for the nation. I know that if our guys are not out there playing, nobody comes to see me administrate. They come to see these guys participate. And so I think that's the one thing that I think that is essential in this conversation, but we definitely need to delve more into this piece to try to create a better structure and opportunity for those athletes competing, particularly at the collegiate level, and the value that they have to these universities and the campuses.
Right. No,
I just wanted to, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Davis.
No, I was just saying like that I agree that, and that's what I was speaking to, the gap, right, between is like if your entire campus is shutting down and sending people home, but you're keeping your football team, then they're clearly essential, right? But then at the same time, you're clinging to language that's saying, oh, they're student athletes, right? And that is the gap that I'm speaking to, and that this moment has really kind of shed all the pretense. You're saying all the quiet parts out loud. Absolutely. I live in a company town. If we're not playing, a lot of people are out of work. That's really important. But it also means that it compels us beyond name, image, and likeness. It absolutely compels us to really evaluate what we mean by that. Because student athlete, as we all know, or maybe y'all don't, I don't know, as a student athlete was a term about liability. It's a term that was concocted to give legal distance to people who were paralyzed or who died as college athletes. It was a term that even the person who came up with it was like, this, y'all took it too far. Like, I didn't mean for you to use it to block all ability of college athletes to, maneuver in the ways that they need to maneuver. And so when we see, even in this moment, I think one of the things I was articulating is, if we see in this moment, this romanticization of student athletes in that term, right? Like, look at what they're doing, and hear them with their mask, and hear all the tests that they're taking so that they can go out there and raise the flag, and they're piping in noise and get lost in it. We're doing this because they do it for the love of the game, or because they're student athletes. And because if somebody, Micah up here opted out of playing and had to deal with message boards saying, oh, you don't care about this, you don't care about that, da 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 da. And that is the chasm in which we're dealing with, because if everything is oriented to treating them like essential workers, absolutely, but then yet you're still trying to hold them in a position in which they cannot, maneuver as workers, right? They cannot unionize, right? These efforts have been gutted. They cannot even profit off of these moments. But beyond that, it's the other type of restrictions. We're seeing this with the NCAA. Now you got me going on about that. But like, you're seeing this with the transfer portal, right? Or the transfer clauses that they've had to go to the drawing board about, because you have people who need to get closer to home. You have people who are dealing with medical issues in their family. And it's really drawing, for instance, into the spotlight how unfair a system is that tries to restrict labor and movement, where coaches can leave tomorrow and still get, a severance package on the way out and a signing bonus on the way in. And somebody who needs to go home to be with an ailing parent, if it's not interpreted in a certain way by the NCAA, they could be sitting out a year, which a year is millions for so many people. And so I appreciate you clarifying that, but I think that we're actually saying very, similar things, but I'm really focused on the gap between the feel good, romantic, look at our student athletes doing so much for our school, and all of the work, all of the labor, all of the sacrifice that is entailed to get to that place, and absolutely what has been built on their backs.
And just
Thank
to
you. I thank you for
quickly,
saying that, because I was going to say, I know Shireen wants to go, but it's that life or death decision that many of those young people are facing. And those were a number of calls that I've taken of individual organizations or even student athletes themselves, and turmoil, and going through really mental distress about what do I do? Because I'm in a home, I take care of my father, I take care of my mother, they're cancer patients, they have diabetes, they're at-risk population. I've got to take care of brother or sister because school is now at home. These young people are then having to then weigh, do I go back into this space and play with my life at risk? Because being a part of a minority group that has sort of these higher at-risk causes, I mean, I'm asthmatic, I throw it out there, is putting them in a position that at 18, 19, 20, you know, what were you doing? What decisions did you have to make? And I think it's a lot to throw on them at this juncture. I just want to throw out real quick before we go that we have opportunity for some Q&A. So populate your questions if you are coming through. So please continue to use that Q&A function, and I'll go to Jules.
Yeah, Shireen, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in on that one. You seem like you had a comment before we move on here.
well, just, sort of occupying a space, we've seen ways, and this was specific to athletes that are in colleges, but we've seen, just to speak to what everybody has said, this idea of forced martyrdom on athletes is really problematic for me. And when the NWSL Challenge Cup occurred, and I realized that's professional sports, the athletes had an opportunity to opt out without penalty. And this is something, if we're going to look at, having them in here and exploiting off their labor, which is already what happens. And Dr. Frank Garritti, a friend of ours at Columbia, has very choice words for the NCAA and how it operates, and in like a mafia-esque type of way. And I think that this is something I always go back to. It's the system that's rotten. Are we trying to grow fruit out of a rotten tree? Like, what is happening? And like Amira, Dr. Davis said, she looks at the gaps. The system for me is problematic to begin with. So are we trying to salvage pieces from that? Like, that's holistically how I see it, and deferring to all three of you. But the one thing I just wanted to add about the messiness that Dr. Northcutt said is another really good example of how this is not going well is the HDA, the Diversity Alliance, Hockey Diversity Alliance, and the NHL, which literally divorced itself from the NHL. So this isn't pretty. It's going to be extremely messy. And I mean, the fact that the HDA completely said we want nothing to do with the body that we emerged from is a clear indication how some of this is actually going. So, I think that, and it's not going to be great. Like, the NHL has essentially been silent, and to just sort of front the HDA to say, we're doing it when they're really not, goes into, like I said, those systems that are actually quite rotten. So there's a lot of things that are being exposed here, and that, we have to keep our eye on. We have to be critical. And what Dr. Carter-Francique is saying is heartbreaking. And Dr. Davis has those students come to them that are really, and it's very difficult. Like, at the end of the day, do we value human life or do we value sport?
Powerfully put. Yeah, absolutely. And, for years, I'm sure people on this panel have had the criticism lofted at them that, hey, we can't mix politics and sports. And yet in this moment, especially focusing on what you were just talking about college athletics, it's almost as if people are saying, oh, it's because we really wanted to mix politics or necropolitics and sports, like necropolitics. This is like a death drive, and a racialized death drive at that. But let's pivot, if we could, to a couple of the questions that we got here from the audience. And please do feel free to keep coming with those questions. I want to try to combine a couple of them going off the athletic departments at the college level. One question says, where does the responsibility lie within athletic departments to make decisions not to play? Who do you think should be included in these conversations? Should coaches be included, players, et cetera? And that second question that kind of dovetails with that is, do we need a new structure if 18 to 23-year-olds are impacting the status and funding of campuses and are therefore at higher risk of COVID? Where do we start this conversation of change?
I guess I'll take some of that, I guess. when you start looking at the responsibility, I think you have to look at the model and the structure. The blue disc, which I'll say the NCAA gets a lot of flack for like these ultimate decisions, but the reality is that the member institutions are part of that decision-making process. So you have to look at the model from athletic directors and then other groups from head coaching groups, et cetera, who are part of this process that you're talking about. And so, you know, decisions are being made at regional conference offices. I'll refer to obviously the Power Five, Autonomous Five, or the Group of Five institutions that are there. They come up with certain strategies and obviously legislation to then present to the national membership, which kind of goes through this committee structure, and then things are enacted. They go up to other boards, which could be the presidents of the institutions, et cetera. And so that's kind of how decisions are made. So it really starts at the base level with the schools and the member institutions and the conferences. And the NCAA is really enforcing what the membership is saying that they want to do. And I'm not saying that things don't happen in ways where there may be an idea or a concept that's being floated, but a lot of the schools are making the legislation. I think that gets lost a lot of time, where the member institutions really don't get held accountable, but everybody can just point to, the NCAA is doing this. A lot of the complaints and I've got experience in working at the NCAA, a lot of complaints that we would get is that we had a rule about something that you actually wanted this. We're just enforcing it. And so I think that's the truth that needs to come out regarding some of the decisions that are made in the collegiate space. Coaches are always involved in decisions. You know, there's head coaches committees, there's things that's out there. I can't speak to the level of engagement that they've had around the pandemic and the safety protocols there. I know that within the sports construct, a lot of folks have been leaning on the medical field. And this is something that's just totally new that nobody was anticipating or expecting. So, you know, it's a lot of work has been going into trying to create, you know, safe spaces for folks to compete and play. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you know, athletes are not monolithic. You know, there's a divide there. You got some athletes who don't want to play and they opt out. And then you got a faction of athletes who do want to play and they try to participate and create opportunities for athletes to compete. So, you know, again, it's you know, we're in a strange time, to say the least, you know, and a lot of, you know, thought processes. It's a mental game. It's a lot of arduous work that we have ahead of us, you know, but again, you know, we just got to continue to persist and do the work. You know, I think we're finding out answers as we go with this pandemic, as well as with, you know, how people are responding to, you know, the events that we deal with from a day-to-day basis. One of the things I don't want to see happen is I do not want any of our athletes' lives to be compromised. And I know I sound probably duplicitous in my comments, and I'm not trying to be that way because you always are thinking about, you know, a person's life and how that is. But, you know, again, this is just a tough dynamic that we have to deal with as a society, particularly within sports.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be more voices at the table. I think the communication around the pandemic has not been great. I mean, I'm just saying, I've been in conversations with coaches who don't know if they're playing, who haven't heard that yet, who are not sure what their status is, but see on TV about like what's going on with football, right? And don't begrudge it, but also with just like a line of communication. I think that there is one of the things that we're seeing is that the enormous cost of rapid testing and to put on safe football games, which has been the revenue priority, as we've talked about, has also resulted in a cash flow shortage that the other twin phenomenon that we see happening is major athletic cuts to teams, to scholarships across the board, major Title IX violations as people are trying to weigh this out. One of the first things to go up on the chopping block at too many of these institutions has been men's track and field, which are oftentimes one of the most diverse programs on campus. They're also one of the biggest male sports that's not football. And if football is untouchable, and in some of the Northeast schools, lacrosse is untouchable, then track and field is a really easy way to cut a program. And so we've seen this, we saw this multiple times. We saw it just recently with William and Mary. We saw it with Wisconsin, saw it with Brown, where Brown cut men's track and fields while citing, they were like, oh, it's not a COVID concern, but we want to be competitive. So Brown's football team was like 0-20 in the Ivies for the last 3 years, and men's track and field had a better record than that, and has All-Americans and Olympic qualifiers and things like that. But in the same breath of cutting men's track and field, which is one of the most socioeconomical and racial and ethnic diverse sports on campus, the sport they chose to reinstate was, or to make a varsity sport, was sailing. Yes. And so I think that that's one of the things that we, when we talk about the ripple effects, like these are the ripple effects that, it costs millions of dollars to be able to rapidly test all of the people needed to safely run a season. And that focus has also resulted in a lot of program casualties. And then we talk about the future of the athletes, which is, I work with a lot of college athletes, and this is the question. I have seen a number of articles and interviews talking about the future of football athletes and what is this going to do and how they need to play for a draft and stuff like that. Football is not the only fall sport. Spring sport athletes completely, and Shireen can talk about this even like with her daughter, right? Like there has been so much disruption, right, to sporting cultures because of COVID. And we tend to look at the professional level, look at the collegiate level, but from youth sports on, there's been a disruption that we haven't had the space to account for. And, I have just so many athletes coming in saying, I don't know what to do. Like this was my schedule and now everything's up in the air. What do I do? Where are these paths for me? What do I do? And there's no easy answers, but I think that the more voices we have in on the conversation at the table, and to your point, Dr. Northcutt, I think so often sometimes that the conversations and decision making is being done at a level that we are still trying to break into in terms of ensuring racial and ethnic diversity, in terms of gender diversity, in terms of socioeconomic diversity. We need people in the places where decisions are being made. And so oftentimes when we think about equity only from the standpoint of what's on the field, we miss what the sidelines looking like, what the boardrooms looking like, what those tables in those conference rooms are looking like, that are going to impact and have a major ripple effect all the way down.
Thank you so much. That it's a breath. I'm sorry, I'm caught up in the track and field, as I was a track and field athlete, and I'm hearing about sailing, so I'm just having a moment. So bear with me with that. As we come to a close, I mean, all that you all have provided has been wonderful, but I want you to think about one of our questions from the audience is, do you feel like we can reimagine and reprioritize sport values? Do you feel we may end up with a reimagined sport system, or are we going to keep the status quo? And as you consider that, think about, what athletes sort of inspire you, inspiring athletes, those organizations that are already making the change that could perhaps speak to this notion of reimagination that we could also use as a compass, and as we direct our organizations and our individual athletes and participants out of through the rest of this pandemic. So I'll start with Shireen.
I think that that's a really great question about whether to keep the existing structure. I mean, I'm literally a co-host of a podcast called Burn It All Down. So, I mean, that, you know, but I think keeping in that, one of the metaphors that I've used is before when explaining that, because somebody challenged me, like, why would you want to destroy something? I'm like, when you go to a forest and they talk about regeneration, you do burn stuff to regrow. And this is part of what it is. There's existing things that work. There's things that don't work. So we have to look forward and take the pieces. Like if this is going to be a system for the people, about the people, that interlocks with sport, then we really need to make it so, as Dr. Davis said, it's not just the athletes that provide this quota for diversity. And this is parallel to sports media. What she's saying, I feel so deeply, because I'm not just interested in being the brown hijabi sports that they can put on the TV. I want to be in the editorial decision-making room. I want to be a senior VP of hiring. I want to be in places where there are decisions to be made, because from what I've seen in sport activism and from my work, unless the people at the table that make decisions are not impacted, there will be no change. So what does that tell us? So where are we in these systems that need to regrow? And I think at the same time, I have a child that was supposed to be in university for a freshman right now, decided to take a gap year. And that was a very painful decision because she literally did not know what was happening, whether she could play, whether she was going to go to the US, whether she was going to stay in Canada. And so the gap year was the solution, which doesn't, it's like 1 year. Does it really, you know, what does it do? Because and this also points to dealing with the kids that are going through this type of anxiety about it. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of what is happening. Am I going to be safe? I've trained my whole life for this moment and now this is gone. So as we look at this, it's important not to just to keep in mind, you know, who is in the system, but who is going to be fed into the system and what that looks like. So actually have no good answer to the question, but I think it's just keeping a very open view and like a wide lens basically on this entire thing to say there's many needs, let's address them and let's try to tick off one at a time in what we're capable of. And for those in power that may be listening, seek out help where you need it, because you clearly don't have the tools present to be able to do that. And when you need that support, those resources, those human resources, literally get them, because we want to make this better. We're not here because we hate sport. We're actually here because we love it. And that's the difference.
You know, kind of jumping in here as well, you know, I think about this reimagining piece, and I know we've been talking about burn it down and build it back up. I'll use the term pruning. You know, I think we're in a pruning process where we need to be clipping away things that don't work so that we can produce better fruit kind of moving forward. From the boardroom conversation and some of the things that I know we're doing over at MLS is being honest with ourselves about what that representation looks like. One of the great things that have come about, particularly with myself being in the player engagement space and having worked in other levels of business within the sport, is creating opportunities for us to interface with athletes on various projects anyway. You know, how are we breaking down those barriers where athletes are speaking to executives? Because that cross-pollination, one, is training our workforce at the end of the day, because again, we start looking at this ecosystem that we're trying to create. How are we developing a succession plan? How are we looking at how are we advancing the game kind of moving forward? So, you know, our athletes are essential to what we're doing, and they are critical to the game's surviving, whether that be soccer, whether that be American football, whether that be baseball, men's track and field. These are the next teachers, these are the next leaders, et cetera. And I think that's critical to the conversation. And so a lot of the stuff that I've kind of laid out regarding the structure within the NCAA, there's also structures that exist within professional sports, and how we're attacking those and addressing the issues is through, and you guys can read about it, the diversity committee that's being created, that's comprised of our board of governors, that's comprised of players, that's comprised of folks from the ERG. So making sure that in the decision-making process, there's going to be multiple voices from people from the technical side, women, Black representation, et cetera, more than one. You know, that's critical to the change that we have. And so kind of how I'm reimagining is that hopefully we can get to the point where athletes are not viewed as dumb jocks, and that they are critical to some of the decision-making aspects of what we do from that standpoint. When we talk about sports values, that's a bit of a loaded question for me, because I don't think that those translate to corporate America 100%, you know, because when you're an athlete and you come from this space, we always talk about teamwork. We talk about trusting your teammate and working next to them. I do think that in some work capacities that those environments don't really exist. And I think what we need to do as a society is try to learn from those things that don't need to be pruned away from what we do in sports context, like recruit talent. So if we're looking to recruit Black talent, let's recruit Black talent. If we're looking to recruit female talent, let's go recruit female talent. Like, those are things that we can be more specific about, and we can apply some of the sports principles to this context to kind of reimagine sport. I mean, really reimagine society and kind of how we move forward in addressing these issues head on.
Thank you. Dr. Davis, we'll have you with our closing thoughts.
Well, I just wanted to flag, I saw one of the Q&As was about youth sports, and I think it's really important. Sometimes when I think through reimagining, right, what sports culture looks like, I love to think about youth sports, because it does hold the key to so much that we're talking about. And I have seen, you know, my family is from the Gulf Coast, and, you know, in the middle of a pandemic, also had to deal with hurricane season. And I just went back to Mississippi to bury my grandfather, and driving to Natchez, Mississippi from Houston, Texas, the sum total of the effect of Hurricane Laura was right on display, and fields were torn up and bleachers were over and roofs were missing. And I said on the podcast we did on climate change about what it meant to be from this area, where so often that these sports, particularly football, is like a great path, like presented as a pathway out, where you're looking at fields that are very hard to play on a coast that's already like cancer coast because of the oil refineries and all the terrible things that are dumped in that area, where there's this like desire where these officials were like, no, doesn't matter that there's a pandemic or a hurricane, we're still going to play no matter what, right? But what is at the core of that is this ecosystem, this community around sports. And the best things that we've seen are when those youth sport people come together and say, like, how can we do this safely? Right? Like, this, not this rush to return to sport because we want to be entertained, but what can we provide for our kids to safely get what they need? And it might look different. It might look modified, right? Like, Friday night lights in Texas look very different right now. I can tell you, I was at a pandemic Friday night game. My sister's dancers were dancing, and there's a fraction of the people very spread out, but it's going on. The show is going on. And I think that the other thing that's happening at that youth level is upending these financial structures that cause so much of the stratification very early on. When we talk about soccer, right? Why some of the work with diversity in soccer, particularly on the women's side, has to do with how we track students and athletes, the financial barriers that get up to play club level things, like all of these things that once we are sitting in a room talking about it at the collegiate and professional level, have missed the pipeline, have missed the pathway, have missed where an intervention could have really, really set a different tone. And I think that whether we're talking about pandemic systems, whether we're talking about racial inequity, whether we're talking about gender inequity, whether we're talking about really the battle to open, to have safe sporting spaces for trans and non-binary youth, all of these conversations, if we can do it more robustly at the youth level, I think that it will really only enhance the abilities that we have to rethink and reimagine our sporting cultures and in our sporting worlds moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I want to thank Dr. Jamil Northcutt, Dr. Amira Rose Davis, Shireen, Ahmed, as well as my co-host, my co-moderator, Dr. Jules Boykoff, for all of those wonderful comments and thoughtful ways that we can, again, begin to look at and continue to do the work to reimagine sport during this moment. So we thank you, and